Hello and welcome to Gardening Basics with 4-HBC. This is our fourth lesson in a series of short videos on beginner gardening topics that range from planting your garden all the way to harvesting your produce. My name is Ellie. I am a 4-HBC ambassador, and it is my pleasure to introduce our gardening expert, Emma. Emma, would you tell us a little about yourself?
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, everyone. My name's Emma, and I am a gardening expert. I have my diploma in agriculture from the University of the Fraser Valley, and I teach a variety of horticulture workshops around the Fraser Valley, and I'm really excited to talk to you about our gardening lesson today.
Wonderful. Well, we are looking forward to learning more today about gardening. What will we be covering?
So today we're going to be looking at home composting, which will include a couple different types of setup options. We'll also look at the basics and some of the benefits of composting, and then we'll get into the do's and don'ts. So this will be things like what to add and what not to add. So first off, we're going to look at some home composting setup options. So check out a quick video that I took that shows you one of these types of options.
Hi everyone. So here we have a really good example of a three-stage composting system. This one is brand new, so you can see we've got one bunker right here that has some compost in it, and then we have another one over in the middle here that's got some materials that will be used for the compost, and then the third stage over there. So basically how this works is you have one bunker that is used for your materials that you're throwing in there automatically. And then once this one gets kind of full, you're actually going to take the material that's kind of well decomposed and you're going to put it into your second bunker. And then once that gets to a stage where it's greatly decomposed and it's ready to go, then you put that into your third bunker. So you always have a bunker that's going to have space for fresh material, and then you're partially decomposing, and then your fully decomposed is also available. So it's always going to have three stages to it. So this is a really good example of what that can look like. Some of the benefits of this is that obviously you always have material that you're going to be able to use. Some of the drawbacks of this is that, as you can tell, it's really large, so it's not very good for smaller spaces. But if you have the space to be able to use this, then it's a really good compost setup to be able to use.
So in the video, you got to see a three-stage composting bin, but one of the ones that you may be a little bit more familiar with is just a black plastic composting bin. These are ones that a lot of people tend to use. It's one of the most common way to start composting for beginners. These are available to purchase at pretty much any of your home hardware or garden supply stores. And the best thing about these ones is that they're really nice for smaller spaces. So they don't take up a whole lot of room. And then they have a really easy access trap door for removing your finished compost. So you still get the benefit of being able to have your fresh material going in on top and then your finished compost coming out of the bottom. Some of the cons or the drawbacks of this type of system is that it does dry out fairly quickly, especially that black plastic tends to get quite warm, so it will take a lot of the moisture out of it. And because it's such a confined space, it can be really difficult to turn, so that's something that you have to consider. And then any compost system really can attract rodents, so that's one of the drawbacks to this one as well. And then one of these systems can also be fairly expensive. And so then this is just an explanation again of that open air three-stage composting system that you saw in the video. So you have your three separate bins that allow for your compost to be separated into your fresh, your middle, and then your finished product. It's really nice to turn. It's large. It means that decomposition happens really quickly. You always have your fresh compost or your finished compost available to use, and you can usually have a larger amount of it stored at one given time. And then because it's a lot larger, it doesn't dry out as easy. Some of the drawbacks to this one as well is, again, it can attract rodents and sometimes larger animals and wildlife. And then it is really large, like I mentioned, for smaller garden spaces and households, especially if you're not going to produce a lot of food waste and you don't have a lot of green waste coming out of your garden. Another thing about this one is that it's going to be more labor intensive, not only with turning, but also when you have to build it. And when you're building it, it may require some things like carpentry knowledge and then the tools and materials to be able to do that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is some basics of composting and then also the benefits for your garden. So check out this video on that.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of materials that you're going to put into your compost. So when we talk about a compost, you need to make sure that you have a good ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And so sometimes this is referred to as brown to green, so carbon being your brown material and your nitrogen being your green material. And so here we have some really good examples of both of those. So you can see here, this is all going to be really high in nitrogen. You've got a lot of greenery, you've got some food scraps. All of this is perfect for your nitrogen component. But what this doesn't have is a whole lot of carbon in it. So when we're talking about carbon, you're thinking about anything that is dry. So all of these twigs and leaves, once these leaves dries, will be really good carbon material. In these plastic bags here, there's dry bits of ferns, there are dry leaves. Other awesome material that you can use as a carbon base would be things like wood chips or sawdust, newspaper, straw, anything along those lines that's going to be brown is going to give you that really good carbon. So when you're starting up your compost, it's really important to make sure that your carbon to nitrogen ratio is 30:1, around there. And the reason for that being is that when you have this ratio of more carbon to less nitrogen, you're going to get a really good flourishing of your beneficial microorganisms and your bacteria that are actually going to help start your decomposition process. You'll get the right type of bacteria flourishing in your compost pile so that your compost pile will decompose properly.
So like I mentioned in that video, getting started, it's really important to make sure that you're considering your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So these components and making sure that you have a good balance of them are probably the most crucial thing to making sure that you have a healthy compost. So you can see in this diagram here, it kind of gives you a really basic outline of how composting works. So basically when you add your brown or your carbon materials plus your green, and then you have moisture and air happening, and then you also have, which are already available in your soil, your macroorganisms and your microorganisms. That's how you get the perfect recipe for compost. So like I said, some materials that contain carbon are things like straw, wood chips, dry leaves. They're all going to be things that are mostly brown and dry, and then everything containing nitrogen is going to be things that are green, so your grass clippings, food waste, green waste. This can also include, if you're weeding your garden, you can put your weeds in there as well, but you just need to make sure that they don't actually have any seed heads on them, because those seeds will actually stay throughout your composting and you may end up adding them to your garden at a later date. But it's a good idea to kind of keep in mind that you want that ratio to be about 30:1. When we talk about getting started with a new compost, it's really important to make sure that you add a good layer of carbon materials on the bottom so that you have that good base to build on top of. To make sure that you do this, it's really good to make sure that you have the right types of bacteria that are thriving. So if you have too much nitrogen in your compost, you can actually get the wrong types of bacteria that will end up taking over it. So that's why we like to have that good ratio. It's also important to think that compost does need moisture. So when you're looking at your compost, it really should be the texture of kind of a wrung out sponge. You want it to be moist, but not super soggy. A really good way to jumpstart a fresh compost pile is to add a few handfuls of mature compost. This way you're kind of inoculating it with some bacteria that's going to help end up doing the job. Some of the benefits when we're talking about why you would use compost, or what the pros of starting a compost pile, is that compost is one of the best sources of trace, which is what we say when we need that they're minerals that are needed in smaller amounts for your garden. So they are really high in things like sulfur, and then they also contain all of your basic minerals like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. One of the most important things about adding compost to your garden is that it'll help retain moisture and add a lot of those beneficial microorganisms to your soil. And then my favorite part of it is that it reduces the need for chemical fertilizers, because you're already giving your soil everything that it needs and your plants everything that they need to thrive. And then it also reduces landfill waste. So it's a good thing to do all around. So next we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts of composting. So here's a short video explaining some of those.
All right, so last up we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts of composting. A couple really good do's are, do make sure that you have that carbon to nitrogen ratio that we talked about earlier. Put anything like your food scraps, so that would be your vegetables, coffee grinds are great in a compost, things like eggshells, those are all really wonderful. do make sure that your compost stays evenly moist. So it should be about the moistness of a sponge that you've actually wrung out. So you don't want it to be soaking wet, but you do want to make sure that there's some good moisture in it. Do make sure that you're turning your composting to compost regularly. So that basically just means that you're getting in, and see, you can kind of see everything that's underneath there. You're getting in and you're really mixing up that compost. You would do this fully and completely for your entire pile and make sure that it gets a really good turn. If you've got it exposed to the air like this, you could add some of that carbon material on top so that it doesn't have too much of a smell. And a lot of people will cover these so that they don't attract rodents. But it's really important to make sure a compost pile like this, you're probably going to want to turn it every 1 to 2 weeks to make sure that you're keeping that decomposition going. Some don'ts of composting: don't add things like meat or dairy or bread or bones or oil and grease. All of those are going to actually have a negative effect on your decomposition. It's not going to be able to decompose properly. You may get some flourishing of the wrong types of bacteria, and you're definitely going to attract things like rodents or other types of pests, perhaps bears, into your compost pile. Also, don't place your compost pile in a really, really hot, sunny location, because it is going to mean that it dries out faster. So if you can put your compost pile in a partly shaded area where it doesn't get a whole lot of direct sunlight right on it. If you do have it in an area that gets really, really strong direct sun, just be aware that you are going to have to make sure that you're adding moisture to it regularly.
So, like we said, some of the really important do's of composting are to make sure that you're alternating your layers of carbon and nitrogen-rich materials, something that we haven't mentioned before. But if you're putting larger material into your compost, cut it into smaller pieces so that it's more easy to decompose, or it decomposes more readily. Like we mentioned, make sure that your compost stays evenly moist, and that you're turning your compost pile often. So this is going to help your material break down and make sure that your pile stays aerated. And that's a really important part, because you want to make sure that you have air going to your compost, so that the bacteria that are in there are the ones that thrive in an aerobic environment and not an anaerobic environment, which is the type that we have when we don't have any oxygen to it. So an average size compost pile should be turned about once every week or every 2 weeks. Things like adding eggshells, veggie scraps, and coffee grinds are really, really good for helping your bacteria break down the materials in your compost. Some important don'ts to think about are things like don't add items like meat products, oils or fats, breads, or dairy products. These will definitely attract pests to your garden, and they will make it so that they don't decompose properly. It is careful, if you're adding things like weeds, be careful that they don't have mature seed heads, because they won't break down and you will end up adding them to your garden when you go to use your compost. So that's a big one to try to avoid. And try not to put your compost in a full sun location, because it will dry out quickly. And also try not to add too many nitrogen-rich products without balancing out the amount of carbon that you add in there as well.
Thanks, Emma. I was really interested to hear about having to turn your compost. In the past, I've tried small compost bins, and I didn't know you had to turn it, and that would probably be why they failed. I do have a few questions for you. Do you have any tips for preventing bears from getting into your compost bins?
Absolutely, Ellie. That's a really good question. I know I talked a little bit about rodents, but bears are another problem, especially if you're in a more rural area. So one of the things that I have come across many times, and that seems to work really well, is just setting up something like an electric fence or a hot wire around your composting system to act as a deterrent. Usually in these cases, the best thing to do is to try to keep it away from an area where bears are going to be able to get into. So if you have a fenced yard, that's got some fairly tall fencing that bears can't climb over, that's going to be kind of a better bet. But they're usually pretty good at getting into areas that we don't want them to go. So for this one, I do like to set up something like just a single or maybe a double strand of hot wire, and you can put it around your composting system, and hopefully that shock will be enough to deter them from getting in there. Another thing that is kind of helpful, and this goes back to your comment about turning, is that the more often that you turn your compost pile, the less fresh material you have in there, and the faster it decomposes. So a bear is going to be less likely to be attracted to a compost pile that's being turned more often, because it's going to have a lot less of that fresh food material on top of it. So that's a good thing to do as well.
Great, thanks. Also, I've heard a lot about worm composting. Is that similar or is it more difficult to handle?
So this is another really, really good question, and something that I find really interesting. Worm composting is a very cool topic, and I could talk about it for a whole session as well. But realistically, the concept is very much the same, just the way that you harvest or you take out your compost is going to be different. One of the fun things that you can do with your regular compost is you can actually add worms to it to help break it down. So your worms are going to be really, really good at going in there and chewing up all your food waste and then actually pooping out what you will end up using in your garden, which is really, really rich in all of those nutrients that your garden really loves. So you can actually buy worms online from a variety of different places, and they'll ship them right to your door. One of the worms that's the most commonly used is called a red wriggler, and I think you can get a half a pound of red wriggler worms for something like $50. There are places that will ship it anywhere in BC. So it's a really good way to kind of jumpstart your compost if that's something that you're looking at doing. But you can also do just your own worm composting setup. And then the only difference with this is that your worms are, when you're harvesting, going to want to stay in the dark. So you basically spread everything out on a tarp, and your worms will all crawl to the bottom, and then you can harvest your usable material that's on top. But there's never any harm with putting some compost into your garden that has worms in it, because those are going to do some really good things for your garden at the same time.
Thanks, Emma, for sharing all this great information on composting. Can you tell us what we will be covering in the next lesson?
So next lesson, we're going to be looking at fertilizers and amendments. So we'll kind of keep going with our discussion on what are good things to add into your garden, and we'll look at breaking down some of the benefits of different types of fertilizers, and get into a little bit more detail about how they work in your garden. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and I can't wait to see you next time.